I had a dog and his name was Blue. I had a dog and his name was Blue. I had a dog and his name was Blue. I bet you $5 he's a good dog too. Here, Blue, you good dog, you. Try that with me. Here, Blue, you good dog, you. Well, I shouldered my gun and I tooted my horn, gonna catch a possum in the new ground corn. Old Blue barked and I went to see, he'd cornered a possum in a cinnamon tree. Here, Blue, you good dog, you. Here, Blue, you good dog, you. Now, Daniel Boone had a dog named Blue. He was a good hunting dog. He was fast as a freight train. Of course, they didn't have freight trains then, but he would have been as fast as a freight train. And he could smell so well that he could stick his nose down in a puddle in Greensboro and he could smell a raccoon over in Asheville. He had a good sniffer.
Well, one day, they were running across a field of tall grass, and Old Blue, he was leaping high so he could see where he was going. And one time he leapt up way up high into the air, and when he came down, there was an old sawmill blade hidden there in the grass. He came down right on that sawmill blade, cut him right in two.
Front end split off from the back end just like that. But Daniel Boone was always prepared. He had a little baggie in his pocket with super glue in it. He took some out, he slapped some on the front end, he slapped some on the back end, and then he held them together. Count with me to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Blue was all back together again. He barely missed a heartbeat. He blinked his eyes a couple of times. Whoop, whoop. He barked. He was ready to go. Well, he was almost ready to go. You see, there was one small mistake that Daniel made. He was in such a hurry to get them back together again that, well, you tell me if you know what he did that kind of caused the problem. He put him to, what did he do? He put his tail on upside down. Oh my God, you're thinking that poor hunting dog, aren't you? That's what you're thinking, aren't you? Go ahead and admit it. You're thinking, that dog ain't gonna hunt no more possum, aren't you? Say that, that dog ain't gonna hunt no more possum.
Well, you're wrong. Because you see, Old Blue, he was a clever dog and he was very, very persevering. He learned to run on his front legs. He just watched old Daniel and he copied him. He'd run alongside old Daniel, but he had one advantage. When his front legs got tired, why, he'd just flip over and back legs. That's the story. Raise your hand if you remember the original Carter family. A.P. and Sarah and Maybelle Carter. All right. Well, I'm going to start out with a couple of songs of theirs. And this was their theme song a little later in life when they broadcasted out of the Texas border all the way to Canada. They like to start out with this song. Keep on the sunny side, always on the sunny side. Keep on the sunny side, the time will help us every day. It will help us every day. It will brighten all our way. It will keep on the sunny side of life. Though the storm in its fury rages today, Russian hopes that we cherish so dear. Cloud and storm will house, and they were trading back and forth. They had the next quest 3 or 4 generations later of people singing the old songs across to the people in England to let them hear them again. And I got to hear the granddaughter of Dellie Norton, who I had heard sing. And they asked me questions, and as they sang, they said, well, now, what's your favorite ballad? And she thought for a while, and she said, well, we've been singing all these serious ballads, you know. I've always really liked this one. And it's about a woman who's very strong-headed. And she said the women in my family were really strong-willed women. You couldn't push them around. There was no man lived over the hill if he ain't moved away. He's there still inside. And that's your part. I come to that each time. Well, now the devil come up to the farm one day, says, why your family I'll take away and hide. He says, please don't take my eldest son. There's work on the farm that's got to be done, and it's hide. Oh, but you can take my nagging wife by hand. She's the first of my life. So we hoisted her up all on his back, and down the road where we can eat back in his high. Well, he got her down to the gates of hell, said, smoke up the fire, we'll roast her well, and it's high.
Well, who likes riddles here? Seems like everybody likes riddles. And there's a song called the Riddle Song. But this isn't it. This is another song about riddles, and it's called The Devil's 9 Questions. And there's an old belief that the devil might meet you on the road, and he might ask you the questions. And if you can't answer them, they'll take you away. And so if you pay close attention, if he asks you these questions, you'll be covered. Oh, what is higher than the tree? Sing 99 and 90. And what is deeper than the sea? And the crow flies over the white oak tree. Well, heaven is higher than the tree. Sing 99 and 90. And hell is deeper than the sea. And the crow flies over the white oak tree. Oh, you have answered my questions 9. Sing 99 and 90. Now you're the Lord's, you're none of mine. And the crow flies over the white oak tree.
I learned it from a friend of mine named Doc McConnell, and Doc was raised up in Rogersville, Tennessee, way back in Tucker's Knob. And he tells this old familiar story on his brother Steamer, his little brother. He says, my brother Steamer always wanted him a baby mule. That was the thing he wanted more than anything else in this world. He could just picture a baby mule. To him, it was like a big teddy bear with walking along on its 4 legs. It was brown, it was hairy. He figured he could learn to ride it, he could ride it around, he could teach it to plow. And as he grew up, well, that mule would grow up and they would be best friends. Well, now one day, Steamer walked into John Mock's general store. And there, sitting up on the counter, were a bunch of coconuts. Well, they'd never had coconuts in the store before, and Steamer had never seen them. Steamer looked at those coconuts and the wheels started to turn in his head because they were brown and they were hairy. And he looked at those things and he said, John, he says, what are those things up on the counter? John says, well, Steamer, those are coconuts. He says, no, they ain't. What do you mean, Steamer? He says, those are mule eggs. He put one of those things underneath his arm and he was just walking home. He had asked John how long it took for that to hatch out, and John said, well, about 2 weeks. So Steamer spread some straw around and he sat down on top of that thing there and he started to count the days. He counted day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 15, day 16. There still wasn't any movement down there. And Steamer was starting to kind of get a little worried there. He sat on there a few more days, and about the time he got to day 21, Steamer was figuring this thing wasn't ever going to turn out the way he had hoped, and he picked up that big brown hare. He went out behind the tobacco shed, thought he'd give it one more chance. He put it up to his nose to take a whiff. Didn't smell like a baby mule. He put it up against his ear to listen to see if he could hear it bray. Didn't sound like a baby mule. Put it against his chin to see if he could feel it kick. And there wasn't no kick. But with the greatest look of disgust on his face, Steamer took that thing and hauled back as hard as he could and threw it way out in the middle of that tobacco field out there. About the time it hit the ground, there was an old long-eared jackrabbit, must have been scared by it, and jumped up out of the tobacco and went running across the field, and Steamer chased it all afternoon, calling out, come back here, I'm your mammy, I'm your mammy. Oh, go on, he finally said, I never could plow that fast, nohow.
Song about crossing into the Cumberland Plateau, and just a stark, it's written as an epistle, a letter back home from somebody who has crossed over into that area. The day I parted away from you, in sorrow, grief, and in trouble too, you gave to me the parting hand, and you wished me safe in old Cumberland Land. But when we got there, it was ice and snow, and it rained and hailed, and the wind did blow, which has caused us so for the morning side, saying here with cold we all must die. Well, I've nothing strange to write to you, preaching is scarce and religion too, but we've a happy land and a fertile soul. Here is honey and wheat, here is corn and all. Well, starving to death on a government claim. And it has to do with the Homestead Act, when the government was giving out parcels of land to anybody who'd go out there and would live out in the Midwest for 5 years, and they could have the land. They had to pay a little bit of money, but mostly stayed on the land. Now, I'm sure you've all seen the pictures of those little prairie sod houses, and in case anybody has a romantic idea that it might be fun to stay in one, this song ought to disabuse you of that. And it's got a good chorus too. My name is Perkins, a bachelor I am. You'll find me out west on an elegant land. You'll find me out west in the country of fame, starving to death on a government claim. Here's the chorus.
of its praises and tell of its fame while starting to death on a government plain. Next time around, help me out. Here comes the favorite verse. How happy I am as I crawl into bed. A rattlesnake rattles a tune at my head. A Gaelic centipede, free from all care, crawls out of my pillow and into my ear. Hoorah, Prairie County, the land of the free, the home of the grasshopper, bedbug, and the fleas. I'll sing of its praises, tell of its fame, while starting to death on a government plain.
I want to start out with a song that's a great sing-along. It's called Little Birdie, and I think of it as kind of a Zen Buddhist Appalachian mountain song. Little birdie, come and sing to me your song. I've a short time to be here with you, and a long time to be gone. Want to try it? Little birdie, sounds good. Come and sing to me your song. I'm a short time to be here with you, and a long time to be gone. Well, little birdie, what makes you fly so high? It's because I've got a true little heart, and I do not fear to die. Here's your part. Little birdie, come and sing to me your song. I've a short time to be here with you, and a long time to be gone. Let me tell you a story. Comes from a storyteller named Olga Loya, who was raised in Los Angeles, but her parents came from Mexico, and she's gathered a lot of stories here and there. One time there was an old woman named Tita Miseria who lived way out in the country. Now she was poor, but she was happy. Era pobre, pero feliz. She had a nice vegetable garden, una huerta. She had some chickens, unos pollos. And she had a beautiful pear tree, un árbol de peras. Oh, she loved to reach up into that tree and grab a nice ripe pear and bite into it. And she'd feel the juice just run down. And she'd say, ah, qué ricas, qué deliciosas son mis peras. How delicious are my pears. There was only one thing wrong with her situation, and that was some muchachos who lived close by. Every few days, these boys would come running through the neighborhood into her yard, and they'd trample her garden, the vegetables. They'd scare away the chickens. And then they'd climb up her pear tree, and they'd grab a pear, and they'd take one bite, and they'd throw it down on the ground to rot. And they'd grab another, take a bite, throw it down. Grab another, take a bite, throw it down, until finally Tita Miseria would go out and she'd say, bajen de mi árbol, ahorita mismo. Come on down out of my tree right now. But they'd say, no estamos listos. We're not ready. Oh, at times like that, her life really did feel miserable. Well, one evening, there was a knock on Tita Miseria's door, and she opened the door, and there was a young man. And the young man said, por favor, Tita Miseria, I've been traveling for 3 days, and I need a place to stay. Could I stay the night with you? Yo puedo quedarme la noche con usted? Sí, como no, she said, why not? She invited him in. She fixed him a nice plate of arroz and frijoles, rice and beans. She put in some verduras, some vegetables, unos huevos, some eggs. And he ate a nice big plate, and he was full. And then she spread out some straw in front of him, in front of the fire, and he lay down and he went to sleep. And he slept well. When he got up in the morning, he said, Tia Miseria, you've been very kind to me. I want to return the favor. He said, I'm a magician. Yo soy un mago. And if you have a wish, I can make it come true. She said, Yo sé que quiero. I know what I want. I want that the next time someone climbs up my pear tree, they can't come down until I say the magic words. He said, well, that's a strange wish, but that's how it will be. So he went on his way, and a few days later, who came to visit Tia Miseria? The boys, right? They came running through the garden, trampling the vegetables and chasing off the chickens, and they climbed up in the tree and they started grabbing pears and taking a bite and throwing them down on the ground. But Tia Miseria didn't get upset the way she usually did. She was just standing on her porch watching them. And they sat up there, it got darker and darker, and the boys started to panic. They started to cry. They said, Tia Miseria, por favor, déjanos bajar, Tia Miseria. Finally, she walked up to the tree and she said, if I let you come down out of that tree, do you promise never, ever to come back here again? Sí, lo prometemos. Well, now, a few days later, there was another knock on Tia Miseria's door, and she thought, es mi amigo, it's my friend again. But when she opened the door, it was someone else. He was tall and skinny, looked like a skeleton. She looked into his eyes and she felt like she was falling into a deep pit. He said, Yo soy la muerte y vengo por usted. I am death and I have come for you. Tia Miseria was a fast thinker. She said, yo sabía que tú ibas a venir. I knew you were coming, she said. But I'm very hungry. I'm really hungry. Yo tengo que comer antes de irme. I have to eat something before I go. All right, go and get yourself some pears, Tia Miseria, and then we need to go. She said, Yo soy una viejita. I'm an old lady. You go and get me the pears. Of course, most of the food that's on our table, most of the vegetables anyway, comes in from California, it seems like, and most of that food is planted and cultivated and taken care of and harvested and packed and sent along here from the farm workers who work out there. They've worked in terrible conditions, but the conditions were even worse before Cesar Chavez came around and helped to organize the United Farm Workers. Out from Arizona in 1937, and he had lived on land that they owned. And they weren't rich by any means, but they had land and they had a big old thick-walled adobe home that the family shared, and he had 200 cousins lived around there, and they had a little store and got by until the drought came in the 30s that drove the folks out of Oklahoma, and it drove them out of there, and they packed it all up and they headed out to California. And it was just a rude awakening after leaving their own farm there and coming into this little one-room shack where they were to stay, which had no doors, and there were 12 of them. And they had to share a bunch of bathrooms, and going out and finding out that, of course, there was no place to do your business out in the fields. And everybody shared the same dipper, so they passed around the same germs, and you did your hoeing with a short-handled hoe, bent over all day long, so that before the age of 30, your back was wrecked. And just all kinds of stuff like that. And people had tried for quite a few years to organize the fields, but found it just impossible. Because people were moving around all the time. There was just too much riding against you. And he just made up his mind that he was going to do it. He got Dolores Huerta to help him. And in 1962, they formed the United Farm Workers. And one of the things they did when they were trying to garner attention was
they had a 300-mile pilgrimage, is what he called it, a march up to Sacramento to draw attention to all the terrible conditions of everybody. And of course, as with Gandhi and as with the civil rights movement, the press came. And they started out with just a handful of people and only one person in the first town would keep them, but as they went and they went and they went, they picked up more and more people, and they started appearing on television in the state and around the country. When they got to Sacramento, they had 10,000 people and a mariachi band to play for them. They got their first contract. Well, one of the things that they fought about a little bit later on was the use of pesticides. And you probably may have noticed that that's still a problem. Well, Tish Hinojosa, who lives pretty close to the border and is a fine singer-songwriter, has this little song that she sang called Something in the Rain. And it's about a little boy, maybe 12 years old, whose sister is dying from the pesticide poisoning. And he's trying to figure it all out, and in the beginning of the song, he's kind of believing the line that had been given him, that it's something in the rain. And then he starts to think about it. And it kind of sounds like maybe he came into contact with some folks who were organizing, because he starts to change his thinking. It goes like this. Mom and Dad have worked these fields, I don't know how many years. I'm just a boy, but I know how. Go to school, work is slow. We have seen our country's roads, from Bakersfield to Illinois. And when trouble comes our way, oh yeah, I've seen my daddy pray. There's something wrong with little sister, I hear her crying by my side. Mom is shaking as she holds her. We try to hold her through the night. And Mom says, close your eyes, baby, told. Dream someplace far from here, like the pictures in your school books. Someday you can take us there. There must be something in the rain. I'm not sure just what that means. I believe to talk so sins of men and prophets break the land. There must be something in the rain, or what else can cause this pain? Those airplanes clear the crops so things can grow. Oh no, there must be something in the rain.
Nasrudin Hoja is the person this story is about and probably comes from, and he lived in the 1200s. He was a teacher. Hoja means teacher. This character, Nasrudin Hoja, appears in many different tales. Sometimes he's foolish, sometimes he's wise. You can decide what he is in this story. One time, Nasrudin Hoja was invited to a banquet at the home of the Mukhtar. He was a very important man in the community. Now, the Hoja loved to eat and he loved to talk. And so all day long as he was working in his garden, he was thinking about the evening ahead of him. And he was so immersed in thinking about this evening and how wonderful it was going to be that he lost track of the time. And he discovered when he had finished and he went home that if he wanted to shower, if he wanted to bathe,
and he wanted to dress up in his fine clothes, he was going to be late for the banquet. He didn't want to do that. So he went on to the banquet in his work clothes, with dirt on his clothes and dirt on his hands, dirt on his face. And when he walked into the banquet, even though he was sure that the Mukhtar recognized him, the Mukhtar didn't pay him any attention. In fact, nobody did. And they seated him at the end of a long table in the back of the hall. And when the food finally came down to his end of the table, there was nothing left. So the Hoja, with his stomach empty and his feelings hurt, slipped out of the banquet and he went back home. And when he got home, he bathed himself completely, and then he put on his finest clothes. He put on an elegant shirt and baggy pants and a great big turban, and on top of it all, he put on his new fur coat. And then he went back to the banquet.
Well, this time, when he got to the banquet, the Mukhtar rose to meet him. And the servant took him and seated him right there beside the Mukhtar in the place of honor. The servants brought him tray after tray of delicious food, and he would take the foods, and people were asking him questions, but as he took the food, he didn't eat it. He started stuffing it into the pockets of his coat. And when he ran out of room in the pockets, he started rubbing it into his shirt. He was rubbing it all over his shirt. The kids thought it was funny, you know. Here he was, the wise man in town, and he was rubbing food in his shirt. But the Mukhtar was kind of embarrassed, and he watched him for a while, and finally he said, "Hoja," he said, "what are you doing? Have you lost your mind?" "No," said the Hoja, "I haven't lost my mind. I'm just trying to teach you a little lesson. You see, when I came here earlier dressed in my work clothes, you barely acknowledged me, and you seated me in a corner way back in the corner of the hall, where there was no food left for me and really no one to talk to. When I came back dressed in these elegant clothes, you treated me as the guest of honor. Well, I haven't changed. I'm the same person who came here before. It's only my clothes that have changed. So it must be my clothes that you're honoring. Out of respect, I'm feeding them first. Eat my clothes," he said. "You are the guest of honor." And with that, he stood up and he left the hall.
And I thank you very much for coming out tonight. I've had a great time. You've made a wonderful audience. I can just see your enjoyment and your appreciation and your singing. And it's been great, and I hope you'll have me come back sometime. Here's the chorus. How do I know my youth is all spent? My get up and go has got up and went, but in spite of it all, I'm able to grin and think of the places my get up has been. Well, old age is golden, so I've heard said. Often I wonder as I crawl into bed, with my ears in a drawer and the teeth in a cup, my eyes on the table until I wake up. I get up each morning, dust off my wits, I pick up the paper and read the obits.